Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 12th episode of the In a Nutshell podcast. I'm your host, Sean Vowells, and as usual, I'm joined by Joe Meade. Tonight, Joe and I will go over Week 6 from the college football part of the Big Ten, and then we'll take a look at Northwestern and Ohio State's basketball schedules as we're within a month from tip. So, Joe, we're going to go to Friday night in the Big Ten. You got this one right. Whoops, sound's coming through there too. You got this one right on the head with it being one of the uglier football games that I've ever seen. I actually watched quite a bit of this game, and yikes. Nebraska picked up the W, but what a really horrendous game all around.
Yeah, admittedly, Sean, I was watching a high school football game in Columbus, Ohio, visiting a buddy, and I think the quality of the high school game was probably a little better than this game. Truly a horrible game, especially in the second half. I think there were only, just wanted to make sure I wrote this down correctly. Yeah, there were only 3 points scored in the second half, and it wasn't really a matter of great defense. It was probably a matter of offensive ineptitude on both points from both sides. Heinrich Harburg, he did rush for 82. Was a little more balanced and played a lot better than he did against Michigan, but generally was unimpressed by both teams' performances. But let's get to the positive side for Nebraska, especially. I think getting a road win, especially against Illinois, a team they've really struggled against. Really, I could argue post and even during COVID, losing to Illinois in COVID, and then to open the year in 2021, they've kind of been a thorn in their sides. And I could argue they kind of started the downturn of 2021 that led to that awful 3-9 season for Nebraska. So I think on an emotional level, very good, very enthralling win for the fan base. Maybe not so much in performance, but obviously more so for result than performance. But Sean, you look at Nebraska's upcoming schedule: home against Northwestern, home against Purdue, away to Michigan State. There's a situation where Nebraska could, and obviously they should take this one game at a time, could get to bowl eligibility by the beginning of November, which would be a huge victory for Matt Rule. It's key that they do not get ahead of themselves and take it one game at a time. Just look at Minnesota a few weeks ago, dropping that horrible game to Northwestern. But for Nebraska, you're sitting at 3-3, and perhaps if you win the next three, just putting it out there, the West is still kind of wide open. Wisconsin's yet to play Ohio State. Wisconsin also does have a few tough matchups coming up as October rolls into November. So for Nebraska fans, I think at this point, you win Northwestern, you win Purdue, take care of those home games. You can really have house money going into these next games, Sean.
Yeah, Rule after the game was not very happy with the performance. He had to say, like, we won and good job, but we made a ton of mistakes, and if we had played pretty much any other team in the conference, it probably was going to be a loss. But we'll go to the big noon kickoff on Saturday. That was Ohio State hosting Maryland off the bye week. They got off to a really slow start. It was 10-10 at halftime. Then Ohio State just had a 3-point lead after the third quarter, but they end up winning by 20. But this certainly was a close game for most of it.
Yeah, Sean, I think there are so many takeaways from this game, so I'm going to try to organize my thoughts accordingly, and I'll smack myself in the face if I repeat something. So, first thing that stands out for me is Maryland in the first half really played a near, I'd say, a very good game. I think the biggest issue they've had has just been a kind of same old Maryland story. Talia Tagovailoa throwing that pick really, they're up 10-0. They go down the field, even if they kick a field goal, they go up 13-0. Ohio State's really not comfortable down two scores where they have to score two TDs to come back, as we've seen in the past 2 years. Instead, he throws that terrible pick six, and I think anyone who's watched enough Big Ten football knew that was kind of the beginning of the end for Maryland. It was kind of a slow death for them in the way where they just didn't move the ball that well. And after this, and it really felt like they were just waiting for Ohio State to kind of just hit the hammer, hit them right on the head. And that's what Ohio State did in the third quarter. I think points of concern for Ohio State that we've echoed throughout the year is their offensive line. Their offensive line was not blocking well. They averaged less than 2 yards a carry on the ground, which is a huge concern. And reading Buckeye film review, reading and hearing the early rumblings for the coaching staff, it wasn't a matter of running backs missing whole shot. It was a matter of the offensive line simply not getting the job done. And against Maryland, who has I'd say a decent defensive line, but nowhere near the defensive lines that they'll face in Penn State or Michigan. So in 2 weeks, Ohio State has a lot to figure out from the performance perspective on the lines. The skill players, again, Marvin Harrison Jr. is as good as advertised. You got to think the Bears fans are already watching those Marvin Harrison Jr. highlights, which are marvelous, not to take away Gus Johnson's fire. But, McCord and the talent ultimately took over. Ryan Day and Brian Hartline called a very good game in the second half, got Marvin Harrison Jr. in space. Emeka Egbuka did go down, but early indications are that he's going to be just fine. Even if they don't use him against Purdue, I think he will definitely be ready for that showdown on Big Noon, October 21st against Penn State. So, biggest takeaways, again, are Ohio State's O-line needs work. Their skill players are still as good. Kyle McCord, I think, played very well. It just took him a few drives to get settled. And Maryland, you got to be kicking yourself. So many self-inflicted wounds, not just the pick six, but the end of the half, the terrible management. Talia Tagovailoa and the coaches, they have to scream at him to just throw that ball in the fifth row, take the points, kick a field goal, be up three, getting the ball, too, in the second half. Instead, they dumped it down to the running back with 7 seconds, and then they just pretty much laid on him and allowed the clock to run out. But nowhere near as bad as the Miami Hurricanes clock mismanagement, but we don't need to get into that. But again, for Maryland, plenty to improve on. I think there were plenty of positive sides. Again, if you go up 10-0 on Ohio State, you go up 10-0 on Ohio State. But really need a complete performance from them, and they have a few weeks to figure something out. Their upcoming schedule's really not that bad. They play Illinois. Illinois have a bye week, and then face off against Penn State November 4th. I think that's probably their biggest game of the year, Sean, at home. And definitely have a lot to improve upon. That's their next big litmus test, not only for this year, but as a program.
So the next game, Joe, we'll go to Wisconsin and Rutgers. Wisconsin wins by 11, 24-13. The defense was able to handle the Rutgers run, and while this game appeared closer than the Ohio State game, Wisconsin was in control pretty much the entire way, up 17-6 after the third quarter. Good performance from Wisconsin here. They looked, at this point, they're definitely the front runners for that Big Ten West.
Yeah, Sean, Wisconsin, it's funny. Joel Klatt describes Michigan as a boa constrictor. I'm not going to say they're even close to the same level as Michigan, but they kind of, on defense, don't let, frankly, bad offenses beat them. Rutgers, I don't think is overall a bad offense, but on Saturday they certainly were. They really could have won this game by a lot more. Braylon Allen did fumble near the goal line in the middle of the second quarter. They went up 10-0. I really think that 95-yard interception was the dagger in Rutgers. I'm not accusing them of quitting at all, but going down 17 to Wisconsin is kind of a death sentence, especially when you're on the road. I think both teams have a lot to work on. I think Wisconsin's offense, this kind of was a good indicator. Rutgers is a very good defense. This is a good indicator that there's a lot to improve on, particularly in the passing game. They did not really get too much going, and if it was kind of in spurts. So Wisconsin, again, Sean, they have a huge test against Iowa this Saturday, and we'll get into Iowa a little later, but I think there's the glass half full side of me would say, now that they know what their weaknesses are on offense, they could, against good defenses too, they could kind of take a look at it. They do have Iowa at home, but for Rutgers, I really think the slow starts are going to come back to bite them at some point. They started off very good against Michigan, obviously coming out of the gate against Wagner, but traditionally the past 2 years, Rutgers starting slow in these games, falling down 7-0. It's just not good. I think Rutgers needs to jump on teams, and they could kind of be the Wisconsin of the Big Ten East, and by that I mean is once Wisconsin gets a lead, they just hold on to it, and falling down 7 feels like falling down 14, the way they possess the ball and the way they pin you deep in their red zone, which Rutgers has the capability to do with the awesome special teams coach that Greg Schiano is. So not impressed with both teams per usual. but definitely have big games ahead this coming week. So jury is still out on both.
So you said Iowa earlier, Joe. That's where we'll go next. Iowa 20, Purdue 14. Another pretty ugly game of football here. Iowa does get the win, but quarterback Deacon Hill was 6 of 21 for 110 yards, a touchdown, and an interception. I don't think really anything different we can take away from this game, but Iowa's defense is great, and their offense is going to lose them some games that they should win and make games that they shouldn't be close pretty close. And they get the W here, but at this point, what else? You got to play near perfect defense and then get a special teams or defensive touchdown or something. But they seem to be chugging along just fine. They had that huge loss to Penn State, but that's it. They've won every other game. So, what do you got about Iowa and Purdue here?
I think eviscerating Brian Ferentz's offensive play calling is something Big Ten pundits and Big Ten podcasters like us have done so much for the past 3 years that's just getting old. So I'm not going to waste our viewers' ears because if they've watched one drive of Iowa football, it's a monstrosity unknown to mankind. But the one positive I could take away is Eric All. If you like good tight ending, and I don't even know if that's a proper term, but just good blocking, getting open, and really playmaking. Every time Hill threw the ball, he was looking at Eric All, threw to him, often missed him. But when he hit him, especially on that touchdown, and especially on that acrobatic catch he made in the third and fourth quarters, it was beautiful to watch. I think Iowa just needs to treat Eric All in a way where he's just their number one and probably only option. I know Reganey had a few drops, and he's been a good sidekick at times for Iowa, but Eric Gall is your most reliable target. He did have one drop, but he made up for it and then some with all the blocking he did for Caleb Johnson and the acrobatic catches he was making in the second half. And Deacon Hill, he did, to be fair to him, not get helped by his receivers on some of those plays, but overall was very poor and very inaccurate. The Iowa fans just cheering fire Ferentz and at 5-1, fire Brian in particular is kind of I'd call it more of a hurricane warning where nothing is bad yet, but you could feel perhaps something coming on. And going to Wisconsin, perhaps that could be it, where if you don't score Wisconsin and your defense doesn't get turnovers, that could get really bad. And Iowa feels like one of these teams, Sean, especially now with no Cade McNamara, where if Eric All gets covered up and Caleb Johnson can't make bursts, and God forbid Eric can't make blocks for Iowa, they could be in some serious trouble. So pretty much they go on offense where Eric takes them. Their defense is still as good as advertised. Phil Parker is still one of the best in the business, Sean. But again, this feels like a storm brewing. We just don't know when it's gonna strike. But if it does, and when it does, I think the Iowa fan base is gonna get as ugly as it's ever gotten.
Yep. Purdue, not really much to talk about there. Hudson Card did throw 2 interceptions. That was all of the turnovers that they had, but still, same problems for Iowa. But they keep finding a way in every other game except for the Penn State game. So the last game here, Joe, we'll talk about your Michigan Wolverines. Put it on Minnesota, 52-10. At this point, Michigan is pretty clearly in the top 2 teams in the country, at least from what we've seen so far. Yeah, Michigan hasn't really had a test, but that's a testament to how well they've been playing because none of these games have been close. J.J. McCarthy, 2 rushing touchdowns, 2 defensive touchdowns by the Wolverines, and 191 rushing yards from a bunch of different people. What can you take away from this one other than that the defense is really good, as we've said, and the offense seems to be clicking?
Yeah, I'm not gonna. This is another thing where like Iowa's offense stinks. I'm not gonna talk your ear off about Michigan's efficiency. This was probably a rinse and repeat of the Nebraska game in terms of getting up early immediately, not allowing any real hope for a comeback. I understand Minnesota completed that half Hail Mary pass at the end of the half, but that was honestly a great throw by Calic Manis, probably his only good throw of the night. to be real with you. And, what more could you say? Two pick sixes. The offense was clicking on all cylinders. Cornelius Johnson did have that one drop, which made Michigan settle for their lone field goal on the night. But, J.J. McCarthy is getting so much time back there to throw. And should his receivers not get open or any of his tight ends and Loveland and Barner, he could just easily run and get out of bounds, which in these games he's going to do. Frankly, he's probably going to run out of bounds until they play Penn State on November 11th. Uh, I think the goal for Michigan, and I'm just going to be explicit, unlike I was last week, the goal is probably going to be in these games to get up really early, get up by at least 24 or 28 points, put in Jack Tuttle, the former IU quarterback, and, you know, hopefully they can hold Corum and Edwards to under 10 carries. They did a very good job of that Saturday. They did work in Khalil Mullings. I think one thing Michigan fans want to see more of is some more receivers. Cornelius Johnson, Roman Wilson, Loveland, and Barner did get a lot of targets, as did Donovan Edwards. But I think they need to work in Savage Morgan, Darius Clemens, and perhaps put more guys on film. Because let's face it, Sean, these next three games against Indiana, at Michigan State, and Purdue off a bye week are not going to be very challenging on paper, barring anything disastrous for the Wolverines. So I still think they should test out their toys, kind of like the kid in the playpen, seeing what else the offense could do. Perhaps they already know. Maybe they know in practice and they're just going to stonewall like they did so masterfully last year before the Ohio State game. So Minnesota, I don't think, kind of like Nebraska last week, I don't think you need to take your bad performance as anything uh, I guess, too concerning. I think you are just what you are. I think you're a mid-tier Big Ten West team. I say that with all due respect. Um, Certainly a team that has very winnable games on the schedule. Probably their goal is to probably get to bowl eligibility, 7 wins, and win one of those rivalry games against Iowa or Wisconsin. But a lot to work on, but definitely a chance to bounce back. And the good news for Minnesota, you will not. Oh, that might be a lie. They do play Ohio State, but I don't think they're going to lose by over 42 points again this year, Sean. So that's one positive they could take away.
Yeah, you said those next three games, Joe. You got two road games against teams that are not terrible, and you beat them by 35 plus and 40 plus. These next three games should be very easy. Obviously, stuff happens, and if you have a bad first quarter, it won't be 40 points. But there's a real chance that these next three could be even worse than the last two, because Michigan that was their most points they've given up in a game this year, and if they're scoring like that, these games are going to be over pretty quickly. So that's our Big Ten Football Week 6 recap. We're just about at 18 minutes, so we're good on time. We're going to go into the Northwestern schedule now, Joe. But first, we're going to take a look at their roster. You see the top three names, very, very familiar. Boo Buie, Ty Berry, Brooks Barnheiser. Those will be their guys. They get Ryan Langborg, the point guard from Princeton. In the transfer portal, Matthew Nicholson is back as well, and then a couple of other names that are not very familiar. Northwestern has got a pretty good roster. Obviously, they lose Chase Audige, who was a tough shot maker and a really good defender, but the rest of the cast is kind of back with a senior Ivy League point guard, so expectations should be pretty high, or at least as high as they can get for this Northwestern team.
Yeah, Sean, one similarity I'll draw from episode we had last week was Maryland. I think returning that core of Bowie, Berry, and Barnheiser is extremely good, especially for scoring. And for three-point shooting, Ty Berry is probably one of the best you'll see in the conference. We'll get into that in one of our preview episodes. But definitely a great scoring and leadership nucleus. Bringing in Langborg, the transfer from Princeton, it just adds more experience onto the team. So clearly a very good thing. But again, keeping those guys healthy, and again, like any star in the Big Ten, you need to keep them healthy. But keeping these guys healthy, like Maryland, is going to be so key. And managing, not load management per se, but really them integrating other guys into the system slowly. So God forbid any of them has to take some time off, that Northwestern will be ready to go. Because other than that, Sean, that's as solid a nucleus as you could get, with the exception of Michigan State and Purdue.
Yeah, you can get Boo Buie off the ball. And, that's your starting five, I would assume, those top five names. And then they have a couple other names. Nick Martinelli, he's back. He was a role player last year. So we'll go into their schedule now, Joe. The Binghamton and Dayton games are cut off, so then we can fit the rest of it. Obviously, their first Big Ten game is really difficult. It's Purdue. It's their only one in December. But after that, they really don't have much of a non-conference schedule, which is a little bit disappointing. DePaul away could be difficult, but really they should be winning that, especially with the fact that they're so close that they should not be an away game. And then they have Arizona State on a neutral. They don't really have any tournament teams on the schedule in the non-conference, and just looking at this now, I think that will come back to hurt them in the end.
Yeah, Sean, the non-conference is as unimpressive. It's probably the least impressive schedule we've previewed, to be quite frank.
Yeah, and it's not even close.
Yeah, I think the neutral against Arizona State is probably their biggest. Away to DePaul, I would say it's decently big in case DePaul has a disappointing year where that could come back to be a quad 3 loss. Definitely possible. And that's a game Northwestern should win, but I think considering that's their second real test of the year besides having that Friday game against Purdue, that could definitely come back to bite them. My message to Purdue, and I'm just going to try to rephrase this to not sound repetitive, is you probably could only lose one game on that non-conference schedule, Sean, and the one game you can lose is Arizona State.
And they have to make the tournament probably, too.
Yeah, absolutely. It's it's I don't know what Northwestern's scheduling committee is like. I get it's the AD, and I'm really shocked that a competitor like Chris Collins didn't have more say in this. Clearly, maybe they didn't anticipate Rhode Island, DePaul, Arizona State all not being so great, but scheduling the likes of Northern Illinois, Detroit, Chicago State. Again, the comments are come rolling in that I'm a Michigan football fan and we schedule cupcakes, which I totally get. But in basketball, Sean, there's absolutely no negativities toward scheduling any really good teams. Unless all 10 or 11 of your games are against top 5 teams, you go like 3-8. It's really not going to come back to bite you. So let's get into their conference schedule, Sean. I think I've got enough rants about their schedule.
Yeah, it just seems to me that they're not going to be able to get into the tournament with an 8-12 conference slate like pretty much every other team that we've previewed has. But you got that tough early January stretch, but other than that, I don't see a big tough stretch. That 5-game stretch of Wisconsin, Maryland, Nebraska, Illinois, and Ohio State seems tough, but no real stretches really catch my eye that much. They'll have opportunities to have a pretty, at least, consistent season.
Yeah, Sean, I think the only other stretch that'll stick out to me is their mid-February stretch is away to Rutgers, away to Indiana, home to Michigan, and away to Maryland. Sean, to be honest with you, those are 3 of those 4 games are games they're not probably going to lose, but any observer of Big Ten basketball would assume you lose. Rutgers and Indiana away is as hard as it gets. Away to Maryland, they didn't lose at home last year, simply put. And I understand Northwestern did win at Indiana. They've had some success there, but going from Rutgers to Indiana, consecutive road games on Thursday and Sunday, that's probably as tough as it gets. I think, Sean, and you could chime in on this, they have to win their games in January to have, not necessarily to make the tournament, but let's say they're on the bubble. Those January games are going to determine whether they're in or not.
Yeah, they can be in a good spot, so where they can handle a 3 or 4 game losing streak. But those 3 games before the 3 games you mentioned, Joe, they have to get all 3 of them. Because if you don't, you could go on a 5 or 6 game losing streak there. But they have Minnesota, they have Penn State twice, they have Nebraska twice. Like, there'll be opportunities for wins, but they can't really, unless they start like really well, they can't go on a 5 or 6 game losing streak because they just don't have enough losses to take. They do need some big wins. in the in the conference season because there aren't any opportunities in the non-conference. But see the projected record there: 20-10, 11-9. I would think that's probably enough to get in, but there's certainly multiple ways that this Northwestern team can regress from last year and miss the tournament.
Absolutely, Sean. And one last thing before we preview our next team is one loss on the schedule. I'll put it this way: besides the games in bold, one loss on this schedule could equal two losses. And everyone who's listened to this show for the past year knows exactly what that means. And frankly, some could be three losses. So Northwestern, I like their team. I know Sean likes them too, but definitely little room for error in a lot of these games.
So we'll go to Ohio State here. Joe, roster comes up. Chris Holtman's back. They've got a number of names back from last year: Akpara, Zed Key, Bruce Thornton. But they do bring in Jamison Battle from Minnesota, and they bring in Evan Mahaffey from Penn State. They have a couple freshmen in there. Roddy Gale Jr. is a transfer from somewhere that I'm not remembering right now, but they do have a couple of veterans. Zed Key, his shoulder should be okay. Last year it bugged him really the entire season, which is kind of why he stunk. But he's really good when he's okay. Jamison Battle is a really good shooter, and we've not really seen him on a competent team, so we're not sure what he's got. But there is at least an opportunity for Ohio State to be a little bit better than last year, because last year they were really horrendous defensively, and it definitely affected their offense, and that's why they lost so many games.
Yeah, Sean, the offense really started clicking in the really right before the Big Ten tournament. They had some solid showings. Winning those three games, I think, was a nice end to their overall awful season. Clearly the worst they've had in the whole mid era. Uh, this really starts before we get to the schedule, Sean. Really three coaches on the hot seat. I'd say warm to hot seat. We'll just say that to be safe. Chris Holtman needs a really good year. He cannot miss the tournament again. And with Gene Smith, the athletic director, stepping down at the end of the year, there's no promises that this new AD is going to be as understanding and patient as Gene Smith has been. So, Sean, with that said, let's get to their schedule.
So their schedule here, we've got Oakland leading them off. Texas A&M at home. Texas A&M made the tournament last year. That's a good opportunity for a win. And then Alabama on a neutral. Alabama's going to be a top team in the country. And then they have UCLA in the CBS Sports Classic. So pretty solid non-conference schedule. Opportunities for some W's. West Virginia on a neutral there at the end of December. Their roster's kind of gutted after Bob Huggins was fired. So that might not be the win that they initially thought it would be if they were to pull it off. But I don't think we really need to talk about that non-conference that much, Joe, because it's pretty solid for Ohio State's purposes. But Minnesota at home and Penn State on the road is a great start to your Big Ten season and a real opportunity for them to start off 2-0.
Yeah, Sean, I can't really comment too much on the out-of-conference schedule. It's, as you said, nothing too hard, but solid enough. Actually four opportunities, Sean. If they do beat Alabama, the good chance they match up with Oregon in the Emerald City final. But getting off that, the home game against Minnesota stands out to me because the Purdue game and the Minnesota game at home last year really started the absolute tailspin Ohio State had in January, which eventually got them to under 500. So there is absolutely no way Ohio State should lose that game. I'm going to come out and say it. Unless someone on Minnesota pops off to be some kind of player of the year candidate, Ohio State has zero reason to lose that game at home. I do think it's interesting that they have Miami of Ohio sandwiched between Minnesota and Penn State. Regardless, those are two games that they need to start 2-0 against because those could be two very bad losses for them later in the year should their projected record of 18-12 come true. So, Sean, the stretch that stands out to me, and it's a long one, man.
8 bold games in a row. That's the most that I've seen going through. I've gone through other schedules, too, from other conferences. No team has a stretch like that.
Yeah, Sean. 11 of their 12 games from January 6th to Sunday, February 18th, which There's a home game against Purdue or in bowl. That is, ooh. There are two ways to look at this. You could say it's daunting, and for a still relatively young squad, it could derail them. But I think Ohio State really learned a lot last year. I think their response to the Big Ten tournament, frankly, a badly coached team and a team that was actually in disarray would have absolutely folded, lost to an experienced team of Wisconsin on that Wednesday in the Big Ten tournament, and just packed it in. But they did not pack it in at all. I think Ohio State is battle tested. I do think, and I'm going to run through this very quickly. Indiana on the road, Wisconsin at home, away to Michigan, one easy games against Penn State, away to Nebraska, away to Northwestern, home against Illinois, away to Iowa, home Indiana, home Maryland, away Wisconsin, home Purdue. My gosh, that's that's going to be the most brutal stretch of anyone in this conference. I know we have a few more teams to preview, but that is hard.
A 7-game stretch with 5 games on the road is just really brutal. It doesn't matter who you're playing. Honestly, traveling like crazy, and 5 of 7 is, I think, the most that we've seen away from home. But, I mean, looking at this, a couple of these teams might not be that good, and these might be easier games at the end of the day, but they need to actually, maybe not. I was going to say they need to do their work early, but they've got opportunities there late to rescue it if need be. But I don't think you want to have to go into that stretch needing more than half of them, because you're probably not going to get. You can play well on a bunch of them and still lose.
Yeah, Sean, of these 12 games, the only non-bowl game being against Penn State. I think, let's say if those 11 bowl games, they win 4 or 5, that's really good.
Yeah, it's good enough.
That's 4 or 5 quad 1 wins, excluding any win you could get in the outside the stretch and in non-conference. So there's ample opportunity for Ohio State. I think, like Northwestern, they simply can't have a bad loss with this stretch. They can't have a bad loss. Sure, they can make up for it, but I think defending home court for them in particular is going to be huge. I think going away that often in that 5 of 7 you said, Sean, is going to be really tough for them. So defending home court, especially against teams that they're favored against, is going to be the absolute key for them getting back into the NCAA tournament.
They do have Minnesota twice, and they do have Penn State twice, which is good. They should win those games. That should be 4 wins.
Yeah.
So it shouldn't be that hard to find 6 other wins from the other 14 games or 16 games, but they've certainly got a big win in the non-conference would go a long way for them, I think, over an Alabama team or a UCLA team that's going to be really good. But we're just going to have to wait and see. Joe, just over 30 minutes, so we've got time for a couple questions before we wrap it up.
Yeah, Sean, and this was the first question, and I knew it was going to come in from Casey, and this is more the Urban Meyer to Michigan State questions. I frankly believe Urban Meyer was in East Lansing last week. Joe, what are your thoughts? I think as a Big Ten fan, Urban Meyer coming back to college football would be great. I really think he would make Michigan State a lot more competitive, and frankly, as a Michigan fan, that's horrifying because Urban Meyer has Michigan's number like no other coach ever has. With that said, I don't know how realistic that really is. Again, I don't think you rush this coaching search. It's probably going to play out, and that's the politically correct answer, but that's what we're going to have to roll with without going on too big a conspiracy theory rant. Sean, I think this last one you should take, and this is a really good question. So the Columbus Dispatch came out with their poll today. Sean, which of these was more surprising to you? The fact they picked Indiana to finish 6th in the conference, or the fact that they picked Michigan to finish 11th in the conference?
I wouldn't say either of them are that surprising, to be honest. There is really a top 2 and a bottom 2, and a mush of teams from 3 to 13 or 12. So that's not super. Michigan, that's probably a little bit low, but if you look at all these other teams, a couple games don't go their way, a couple injuries, stuff happens. They could finish 11th. Indiana 6th, that's probably about right. But I think it's just these Big Ten polls they're gonna have their top 2, they're gonna have their bottom 2, and then could be anywhere in between there. those 11 teams or so. But you'll see Michigan probably as high as 5 or 6 in some polls, and as high as down those 11 or 12. We're gonna find out.
Yep, Sean, we're gonna sneak in one last question and then we will end. This is from Billy, who Villanova. So maybe you're Penn State, maybe you're Rutgers. Who knows? Who cares? Uh, Ace Baldwin is picked for transfer of the year. Besides Ace Baldwin, Jamison Battle, and Olivier Comwell, well, that's the three major transfers. Who else could be a candidate for transfer of the year in the conference? Sean, what do you think?
Um, I mean, I'll say Kelaware to Indiana.
Yeah,
He's got to be good this year. Indiana's gonna give him a lot of chances to be good. He was supposed to be a one and done, but Oregon didn't go to plan. But you don't just get high praise for nothing. Woodson will get him to work hard. He's certainly a candidate for a all conference team. But those three are the big ones.
AJ
Battle,
Store, perhaps. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. AJ Store from St. John's. And Kamala, we'll see what he does. He was kind of a product of a weird kind of system at Tennessee where they played like 12 players and one of them had a good game every 3 weeks. And then Kamala was the guy who kind of had a good game more times than not, but he also had nothing games. So, and he do it every game. Ace Baldwin, he was the best player in the Atlantic 10 for years, but he just got hurt too much. So. He ended up getting an award, the Big Ten or the A10 Player of the Year once when he missed like 10 games, which just shows how good he is. No other huge transfers come to mind. Unfortunately, for the Big Ten, the big transfer news was the big guy from Michigan that left the conference to go to Kansas. There's certainly a lot of good role players or fringe starters, fourth or fifth best players on teams that are transfers, but I don't think, other than those four, that the best player on any team is going to be a transfer, unless it's a huge surprise.
Yeah, Sean, I think that that's very well said, and I don't want to interject anything that would ruin that rant. So,
All right, so that's all we have for you today. Thanks for tuning in to the Week 6 recap and Northwestern and Ohio State schedule look. We'll be back on Wednesday probably to preview Week 7 of college football and to get into a couple more basketball